All right, it's about that time. Start up. Welcome. Thanks everyone for coming. Quick reminder, everybody please silence your cell phones and whatnot. Also, before we begin, I wanted to mention that all these slides, along with everything I'm going to say, it's all available at dsvolition.com, so you don't have to worry about writing down everything I say or taking pictures of every slide. So my name is Dave Bianchi. I'm a systems designer over at Volition. Most recently, I acted as a systems design lead for Saints Row 4. But I've been working at Volition for over 9 years now, spanning 7 in-house titles, including the entire Saints Row series. I was also the only vehicle designer in the studio for Red Faction Armageddon, Saints Row 3, and Saints Row 4. It's also worth mentioning that I come from a computer science background, a fact which I find leads me to technically demanding systems like vehicles. I like them. Also, a bit of fair warning, there's going to be a little bit of math ahead. It shouldn't be too bad. To give you an idea of where the concepts of this talk came from, I came on the SR3 really late in the project. There was about 6 months left until submission. And at that time, the vehicle handling hadn't even started. In fact, not a single one of our vehicles was first pass complete. And there was a mountain of work ahead. Saints Row 3 featured over 90 vehicles, each of which would need its own unique handling. The majority of those were cars, which are actually the most complicated. But we also had motorcycles, tanks, boats, planes, helicopters, and VTOLs, which are basically a helicopter and a plane put together. So each of those really counts as 2 vehicles. And this talk is about the things I learned during that time, so I'm going to be talking a lot about vehicles. But that might be something that you do or don't work on personally. But a lot of these lessons have, far wider design applications than just vehicles, especially with systems that are technically complex, have a lot of assets, or are related to player traversal and feeling. In fact, nearly every single concept in this talk was effectively used in the design of the super movement that was seen in Saints Row 4. And throughout this talk, I'll go through the 4 main aspects of working on complicated systems like vehicles. Understanding what we're working with, reducing external dependencies so we can avoid rework, taking on the bulk of the work itself, and utilizing feedback to strengthen the design. The cornerstone of being able to work quickly on something complex like vehicles is to come to really understand how they work. But how hard could that be, right? It turns out it was the most technically demanding system I've ever worked on. And I'm no slouch. I worked on some doozies. I worked on Red Faction's destruction system, for example. But like so many games, Saints Row uses a Havoc physics engine. Working in Havoc can be a many-splendored thing, but it's a simulation engine at heart, so it's really complicated to work in most of the time, and Havoc vehicles aren't an exception. Between the various Havoc properties and those specific to SR3, a single one of our vehicles can have over 350 variables. Here's a peek of what the handling properties looks like for a single vehicle on Saints Row. You can see it's a big enough file that PowerPoint doesn't even like it, and on this gaming laptop, it chugs. And that's just one of several tables that affect a given vehicle. But having so many variables isn't entirely foreign. For instance, one of our weapons can also have hundreds of variables. The even bigger problem is how interdependent these variables can be. For instance, something as simple as how fast a car turns can be affected by over 25 variables, including wheel friction, yaw torque factor, inertia shape, viscosity friction. I can go on. But with all those variables, you'd think you'd have everything you could possibly want. But some of the most important variables aren't defined as you would think. For instance, within that 350 variables, not one is acceleration. How could it be that with all those properties, something so basic isn't in there? So obviously, there's quite a bit to learn about here. We've all done plenty of online research, I'm sure, but the problem with vehicles is that most of what you find online is not very useful. You too often come across racing enthusiasts that talk about specific real-world values and ways to turn cars like this. 4.56 is a good gear ratio for drag racing. Now this is less than helpful as it doesn't really get you to why that would be a good ratio or what changing that value means to the handling of the vehicle. If you've never gone there before, howstuffworks.com is a great source of information for all sorts of technical stuff, as they actually break down the how and why of it all. And while it certainly doesn't have everything you need to know about vehicles, there was a good section on gear ratios that is actually pretty easy to understand. But the best resource I've found is a website, a small little website, by a couple of guys at Stanford who began researching the physics of vehicles in order to better decide on a new vehicle to buy. This site has lots of real-world equations on the physics of cars that you can really sink your teeth into. But the problem is these guys are super nerds, so it can take a bit to translate everything they're saying into something you can actually use. I think a lot of designers would be afraid of taking on that task. So I thought it'd be useful to give an example of taking something complex and making it easier to work with. Here's our sample equation found on the site. I think most people would find this guy pretty daunting. So we need to change it into something we're more comfortable with. Something like this. Here's an equation I would guess most system designers or even just players are well aware of and are comfortable using. Damage per second is equal to the damage per hit divided by the time between those hits. But how do we get there? Well, luckily this isn't school, and what we're interested in isn't so much a correct answer, but how various parts of the engine affect each other. So this allows us to take some liberties with the equation. For instance, the middle section here is about rolling resistance. And resistance is never a primary factor in motion, and we're not really interested in it right now, so let's just consider it constant and remove it. Similarly, the last section is about air resistance and drag, and again, we're talking resistance as a fraction of total force, so let's get rid of that one too. And how many of us think of anything in force, in newtons? I'd much rather think of things like acceleration. Thinking back to high school physics, F equals ma, so let's make that conversion. And we can get the F out. High school math comes in again. Algebra says we can move that mass to the other side by multiplying both sides by 1 over m. All right, so now we're getting pretty close, but I would guess many would still be intimidated by all the symbols we have here. This still looks pretty mathy with all these subscripts and Greek letters. So let's just replace all those symbols with what they mean using the legend here. And finally, we have something that's downright usable. And again, what we're looking for here is how these values interact with each other, which you can tell by what side of the equation something sits on. So we know that increasing gear ratio will increase acceleration because gear ratio is at the top of the fraction. We also know that increasing mass will decrease acceleration because mass is on the bottom. And this begins to tell us how to deal with changes. For instance, if we're making a special monster truck variant of a vehicle that has twice the vehicle radius, we can compensate by doubling the differential ratio in order to come out with the same acceleration. It's science. And the end result looks a whole lot like our DPS formula. And remember that as far as understanding how to use it, this equation is really no different than that acceleration formula. If you wanted to increase your DPS, you could either increase your damage per hit, because that's on the top, or decrease the time between hits, because time is on the bottom. So in the end, this is really exactly the same level of complexity, even though this formula looked more complex. And of course, if you're really not comfortable doing any of this yourself, I'd wager there's a friendly neighborhood programmer near you who'd be happy to display their mathematical prowess and help you out. So in time, you'll come to an understanding of cars, but they're complicated and there's a lot of them. And just understanding the properties isn't where things end, because changes that others can make can easily create a need for rework. When working with lots of assets, that type of inefficiency can be the death of good systems. So we need to reduce the effects of outside sources. When you're working within a simulation engine, even if you aren't going for a simulation feel, every part of a vehicle affects the handling as they do in real life. Some of these values, the shape of the vehicle, its wheelbase, the center of mass, are all dependent on the asset rather than design-driven variables. Likely you already intuitively know this to a degree. Which do you think would be more agile? This huge armored car or this tiny little smart car? Now here's one that might not be as immediately obvious. The elongated shape and slender wheelbase of the limo means that it's going to turn like a boat, and it's going to be one of the hardest vehicles to actually make feel good. But for the most part, I suggest you embrace these truths instead of trying to work against them. Working against the nature of a vehicle adds quite a bit of work, and it ultimately might not be so successful. More importantly, working with the shape of your vehicle leads to an authenticity to its handling and helps to uphold your players' expectations. How would it feel if you got in that limo and it accelerated like a supercar and turned on a dime? It wouldn't really feel like you were in a limo. I don't know why you would want to be in a limo, though. But the real problem here shows its head in iteration. This dependency on the asset can easily lead to a situation where artists can't freely iterate on their work, as any changes to the shape, even slight, might mess up the handling of the vehicle. Take this example from Saints Row 4. The collision on this UFO, shown in blue, doesn't take into account the wings, which can lead to pretty significant clipping. This is clearly a bug, but fixing it is going to change the shape of the vehicle, which in turn, if left unchecked, could lead to significant changes in how the vehicle handles. A change like this could even lead to needing to redo the vehicles from scratch. And that's assuming you're even aware that the change occurred, since this would be addressed by a vehicle artist, not by a designer. And that's obviously not very efficient. And when you're working with lots of assets, you obviously don't have time to redo a vehicle every time there's a bug. The solution is to separate the physics shape from the vehicle by aligning to Havoc, which is our physics engine. Havoc was already accepting center of mass that was defined in the model. So to make it less dependent on the asset, we simply made a design-driven offset from the model's center of mass point. And that allowed us to move the center of mass as needed without editing the model. To separate the shape from handling, we basically create a fake box that represents the inertia shape, which is the physical handling shape as far as the simulation is concerned. Looking at this example car, the yellow box is essentially what Havoc thinks the vehicle is shaped like. And because this is defined independently and by a designer, changes from artists are less likely to affect the handling of the vehicle. And when setting up this box, you can still follow the general shape of the vehicle to maintain that authenticity while still defending yourself from future changes. So that makes us less dependent on the asset, but the separation will never be full. We also need to agree on a couple of rules to ensure artists aren't affecting the handling in other ways. For instance, artists try not to make drastic changes to the shape of the vehicle, including moving its wheels, which can still mess up the handling. Now, every once in a while, we do come across something that necessitates a change here, but it's on the order of 1 or 2 vehicles per game, and the option would be 90 vehicles every time there's a bug. Since these steps allowed for more control for design, they also result in some unexpected benefits. Now, I always love to see that, because in my experience, when you're making the right move, you end up with unexpected benefits. But when you're moving in the wrong direction, you end up with negative consequences you didn't see coming. Since design could essentially define the shape of the vehicle, we can now do things like lie and say that small vehicles like this motorcycle are much larger than they actually are. You can see here that the yellow box in the picture is telling Havoc that the motorcycle is many times bigger than it actually is. And this helps stabilize small vehicles so that their handling isn't quite so twitchy, And it also means that when they obviously get into collisions with much bigger vehicles, they don't get thrown around like they were nothing. This also helped to better transfer handling properties from one vehicle to another, since the exact shape of the vehicle isn't as dominant on its handling. This came in handy when working on future vehicles, like those from DLC or Saints Row 4, as we can very quickly get basic handling on a new vehicle based on the values from an existing vehicle that we want the new one to handle like. So at this point, we have a good knowledge base of how cars handle, but it's all academic, and that can only get you so far. What we don't have is context. We don't have the feel, and at the end of the day, that feeling is really all that matters. What you need to get to is this: a car that still has feeling, it still has character, but with a deep enough understanding to execute and iterate on it. Before we can really sink into the meat of the work, we need to define the vision, the style. This definition can remain pretty high level for now. As you build up your comfort level in your new system, the picture will become clearer. In the case of Saints Row 3, we had a game-wide style goal of exaggerreal. It's creating something larger than life, very over the top, but generally not outside the bounds of possibility. But what does that mean for our vehicles? This led to the following goals for vehicle gameplay. We want to create a weightier feel, something that felt more grounded with greater differentiation between the way the different cars handled. We also wanted to make more room for player skill to come into play than in previous games. As always, we wanted to continue pushing on the sense of speed, which I'm going to go into in a bit. But along with all these goals, we needed to remain easy to pick up and play. And in many areas, we needed to get better in this regard. Saints Row is a mainstream game, and vehicles represent a huge amount of play time, so players of various skill levels needed to find them palatable. With a high level of vision defined, it's time to begin defining individual vision for a specific asset. This may be different than what you're used to. It's pretty nuanced, and most of the time, design vision exists in broad strokes. It's usually about interactions of game mechanics. But the vision for how a car handles, along with most camera and controls work, is all about feeling. How does it feel to drive that car? This process is pretty hard to talk about because, in all honesty, I can't really put into words exactly what I want a car to feel like. It's really just all up in my head. But it doesn't, just because it's hard to put into words doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Try this. Take a look at this vehicle. This is the Enfuego. Your gut reaction. Imagine how you think it should feel to drive this vehicle. This is the very beginning of that vision. Now try to delve deeper into it. Break it apart. How would this car accelerate? How would it turn? How would it react to the resistance of moving a thumbstick? How would it drift around a corner? You just created the beginning of a vision of feel. It will grow deeper in time as you work and get to know the car better. It will also mature as you work on other assets in the game, as you become more aware of what you can do, how you can do it, and how this piece fits into the larger whole. And finally, it's time to begin turning the vision into reality. When working with a huge number of assets, as can be the case with vehicles, it can be difficult to know where to begin. They say that with written work, it's best to just start doing it. That as you begin to write, you'll spur other ideas, things will begin to flow, and you can always go back to the beginning later. And I think that's pretty applicable to design work as well. Which isn't to say some places aren't better than others to start. When starting with systems you aren't familiar with, it's helpful to begin with an asset that gives you some of that familiarity. Since we're looking for accomplishing a feeling, selecting an asset whose feeling you're more aware of can help the process along. I would imagine this Cosmos fits that bill for many people here. It's your typical no-frills coupe. Another good option is to start with an asset you would consider the average or common case. You won't always have the luxury of being familiar with the work at hand. But this Cosmos fits that bill as well, which makes it a particularly good asset to start with. Defining your common case first can help inform what your uncommon cases need later, whereas the opposite isn't usually true. What you don't want to start with is this. This vehicle is called the Pulse, and it's pretty weird. Its shape and three-wheel design means it's going to handle completely differently than any of the four-wheeled vehicles or two-wheeled motorcycles. And that's actually great because a vehicle like this is all but assured its own unique handling style. But if it were the first vehicle you ever worked on, much less of the work would be transferable into other cases. Whichever asset you begin with, as with most design work, never expect to call your first pass done. More important than nailing it the first time is the learning that comes along with the process. As you move on to other assets, you'll surely learn more and become more adept at the work. Just like the first line in a written work, you can always come back later. With our basic vision defined, now begins what could be a lengthy journey of experimentation with our new system. The first thing I like to do when a programmer gives me a new variable is to ask for information on it. On top of a description, it can be informative to ask what the expected range is. Test out the variable at the extents of that range. These pictures show how moving center of mass up and down on a car can affect how much the body rolls when turning. Note how changing the value affects the feel. You can see here at the bottom of the expected range, there's almost no body roll at all, which makes the vehicle feel stiff. I then like to break outside those suggested ranges, trying a very high value, and don't be afraid to try 5, 10 times higher than the expected maximum. You know, sometimes the expected values don't end up being the right ones, but more importantly, going outside the normal bounds can sometimes give you a better idea of exactly what's going on with the variable by accentuating its effect. This is especially true with subtle or difficult to isolate variables. So, lesson learned, when you put the center of mass too high, the vehicle just kind of flips over all the time. All right, well, now let's try an extremely low value. So here's another kind of harder to see lesson, but if the center of mass is below the vehicle, it actually rolls the wrong direction when you take a turn. Here's a comparison with the right roll direction. All right, so then you use these initial values together to give you a bearing so that you can take an educated guess at a good value in between. And then you go up or down as necessary in progressively smaller increments as you come closer to what seems like a good value. Of course, don't worry about finding the absolute perfect value. You're still experimenting, and there are many more variables to work with, so something in the ballpark is fine for now. And note that if you end up landing on a value that's outside the expected range, it's generally a good idea to mention that to the programmer you're working with to make sure it's kosher to use a variable like that. And if it creates a problem, work with them to find alternate means of accomplishing that newfound goal. During this experimentation phase, your goal should be to build up intuition with how changing variables changes your feeling and how all the variables interact with each other. For any given problem, there are often several paths to a solution. And a big part of building intuition with vehicles is in knowing the right way to solve any given problem. As mentioned before, over 25 variables affect how a vehicle turns, with varying degrees of effect. And since everything is interconnected, changing any one of them will most likely result in differences in some other part of the vehicle's handling. Developing the intuition can help you avoid changing things the wrong way and build awareness of where the secondary effects are going to be so you can compensate for them. You're also going to want to watch out for your big players. These are the variables that have a greater effect on behavior than others. These are going to be your go-to variables, the first place to go when you want to change the way something feels. You need to get to know these guys really well because you use them a lot. A great example of this with vehicles is mass. Changing the mass changes pretty much every aspect of a vehicle's handling. Its acceleration, its turning, its suspension, how it behaves in a collision. In fact, it's so integral to the behavior of a vehicle, mass ends up being the alpha variable, the one you want to set early and be wary of any changes in the future, or else you might have to do a complete new pass. A very important note when working on iterating feeling, Getting instant feedback for changes is absolutely paramount. That's actually like a real product, by the way. It's awesome. In Saints Row, for instance, I can hit tilde and the V key at any time, and I'll refresh all the vehicle data. But whether it's running a refresh on tables, tweaking values through console commands, or fancy live updating, when working on accomplishing a specific feel, you're likely working with very subtle changes. So putting time in between testing iterations from having to reload a level or restarting your entire game can mean it's nearly impossible to truly understand what the latest change did to alter how things feel. Now that we've built up a certain level of comfort with the system, it's time to divide and conquer and start applying what we've learned across all of our assets. For assets as complex as a vehicle, it's good to break up the work and take it on in smaller chunks, and then tackle that particular aspect across several or even all of your assets in a single pass. This leads to several benefits. By focusing on a single part of the whole, you'll be able to dig deeper into that aspect of your system. And across working on it on multiple assets, you'll learn a great deal about how to best work with that portion of your system. Taking on smaller chunks can also keep things from becoming overwhelming when working with daunting assets. Maybe on this pass, you only have to work with 5 or 10 variables instead of 350. Working in passes can also make it easier to see the difference between your various assets, as you'll move on to the next asset more quickly with previous ones fresh in your mind. And finally, working in passes can help to eliminate human error. When trying to take on a complex asset in its entirety, it's easy to forget about one piece or another. As an example, when I drive cars in games, I basically never brake. So it's easy for me when I'm working on a car to forget about braking altogether. But by taking on braking behavior as its own pass, that ensures that I give every single car the love and attention it needs. Now, it's a bit more difficult to split up the work into discrete chunks for vehicles because of how interconnected all the variables are. But while general handling can't be broken into smaller pieces, there are several other parts that can be taken on individually. Here's what those other passes could end up being, but of course the exact passes change from system to system, so my exact list here is probably not overly relevant. Now, when working on passes like this, be sure to always revisit the first few assets you hit in a given pass. Inevitably, while running through the pass, you'll be learning along the way, and thus you'll end a pass with a better understanding of the subject matter than when you began. So revisiting the early ones means they don't get the short end of the stick because you hadn't yet mastered that part of your system. Now, a big part of work with vehicles and lots of other traversals work is accomplishing a feeling of speed. Now, this can be difficult for any number of reasons in a game. In Saints Row, for example, we had a very hard limit of 100 miles an hour. If the player could move faster than that, he'd be able to drive into new areas faster than we could load the world around him, and so he'd constantly be driving into unloaded zones. And just as importantly, while you always want to go fast as a player, the fact of the matter is most players aren't good enough to drive through city streets, weaving through traffic, and taking turns at 100 miles an hour. It's just too fast. But that doesn't remove the basic human desire to go fast. The desire is still there, so we have to address it as best we can. As with many things in design, luckily perception tends to win out over reality. So the solution here is to develop methods that make it seem like you're driving faster than you actually are. Not being able to go much faster than many people drive on the highway forced us to develop a myriad of tricks. Looking at altering perception led to a handful of new opportunities, and these were all very easy to implement, especially when compared to something like rewriting an entire world streaming system. Something as simple as keeping the camera close to the ground can make things feel much closer, or faster. It also keeps the camera close to the action and makes the player feel a stronger connection to the driving experience. We also added a camera shake that would kick in above a certain speed and become more intense as you approach the maximum speed. And camera shakes make things feel a bit less controlled, which then automatically adds to the player's association with speed when in a vehicle. And the effect can be surprisingly palpable. Notice how this GIF infers a certain speed, and you can't even see where the car is going or even if it's moving at all. But probably the single most useful trick for altering the sense of speed is your camera's field of view, or FOV, which alters the perception of depth. Take this shot, which is at a fairly standard FOV of 50. Now compare the same scene with a significantly lower FOV of 20. The player is standing in the exact same spot in these two pictures, but notice how much closer the building in the distance appears in the 20 FOV shot. Lower FOVs squash your distances, making everything appear closer. Now let's take a look at the other end of the spectrum, increasing our FOV to 100. Higher FOVs accentuate distance, making things feel farther away. So see how far that building in the background is now. Since a higher FOV makes distances seem farther than they are, it also makes travel feel faster than it is, since it feels like you're moving a greater distance over the same time. The effect of shifting FOV is well displayed in a cinematography trick you may recognize called the dolly zoom. Notice how it looks like the depth of the scene is stretching around the actors. This is accomplished by drastically increasing the FOV of the camera. All right, get ready for some shit. Each of these methods are fairly subtle on their own, but don't underestimate them. Together, they can make a pretty big difference. Take this example of the Temptress, which is one of the fastest vehicles in Saints Row. This shows how it looks to drive at 100 miles an hour in our city. So it's not too shabby. I mean, I crashed, but whatever. All right, so now let's see what happens when I'm no longer using those tricks in my favor. Keep in mind this is the exact same car, and it's going at the exact same speed, and it's taking the same path. It feels almost unbearably slow. But these three tricks are just the tip of the iceberg. There's many more things we do to make our cars feel faster than they are, and there are many more still that we aren't using yet. Audio, for example, can be a great way to alter the player's perception, but I can't say that we're yet using that in Saints Row as far as sense of speed is concerned. One last tip before we move on. A tool that I use regularly is to sleep on changes before checking them into source control. In a single day, you're likely to make hundreds of subtle changes and thus play with tons of iterations of the feeling you're working towards. Getting so close means you can become numb as to whether or not what you end up with is actually even an improvement. As an example, if a vehicle isn't very good at drifting, I'll spend so long working with that vehicle, I'll unwittingly be accommodating for its shortcomings. I'll learn to drift how that car drifts, even if it's wrong. So it's often quite helpful to hold on to your changes until the next morning and try them again. The night helps break you out of knowing the asset too well and allows you to better criticize its handling. In some cases, you may need to even spend multiple days before checking it again in order to break yourself out of knowing it too intimately. But ultimately, there's no escaping the simple fact that you're going to be way too close to your system. This happens in every type of design, whether you're working on level layouts or player progression. You're well aware of every aspect of your intention, and thus you can't be the best judge of how intuitive your design is. And even in the best case, you only represent a single view, and your design likely has to work for millions of players. Which leads us to feedback. Since you'll be getting so close to the problem, you'll need to verify your work through other sources. The first place to look is within your own studio to your fellow teammates. A very simple method for internal review that's excellent for reviewing a large quantity of assets is what's often referred to as crank format. Crank format involves regularly getting together with other team members involved in a specific area of your game. Then you select a group of assets for review, with the focus being on quickly creating a list of action items. A goal time frame is set for making the identified changes, and after which the group gets back together to verify the adjustments and then review the next set of assets. Now, importantly, all of these reviews should be done through the hands-on time by a different member of your team, someone besides you who doesn't know exactly what to expect from your asset. Note that while doing internal review by other team members with something technical like vehicles, there's usually a certain level of translation that's needed to get from the comments you'll receive to a list of actual action items. This is mostly due to a lack of common understanding and vocabulary. Be prepared to ask lots of clarifying questions. For example, if another designer provided the feedback here, this car isn't peppy enough, you might ask, do you mean it doesn't accelerate fast enough or that it isn't agile enough in a turn? I find it helpful to supplement these peer critiques with my own personal reviews. While cranking on assets as a small team, I'll also review them personally between the meetings. This functions as an extension of the sleep on it mentality, as by the time an asset comes up in a crank review, you probably haven't played with it in a while, so you can make a more accurate assessment than when you were fresh off working on it. These personal reviews are important, as whereas others can provide a new perspective, as a systems expert, you'll find that you're able to look deeper than others, capable of finding smaller, more subtle issues. Also, performing your own personal reviews can help to translate the feedback you've been receiving at your crank meetings from the other teammates. But of course, there's only so much you can get with internal reviews. The problem is everybody working on the game is likely well aware of your intentions. To get the freshest eyes, you need to bring players from outside your walls into playtest. Because external players don't know exactly what you're going for, external playtesting often finds problems you wouldn't even think to look for. Often things we designers just take for granted because of a general assumption that, they've always worked. Also, don't mistake the fact that playtesting is at the end of my talk for it only taking place at the end of a project. Begin testing as early as you can and as often as you can afford. So the planes of Saints Row 3 showed themselves to be a great example of a problem we didn't even know we had. Because we already shipped Saints Row 2 with these planes, it would have been easy to just assume that they worked and move on. But not much gameplay in SR2 actually revolved around planes, so they weren't really scrutinized for reusability at all. What changed that was these guys. This is the F-69 VTOL. And these were the signature vehicles of Saints Row III. They were in pretty much every single piece of our PR strategy and our E3 demos and all that. So they needed to be great. But they combined all the usability issues of helicopters, threw in the complexity of planes, and added the difficulty of transforming between the two, which meant completely changing the player's control scheme at the press of a button. The demands for usability were immense. And simply put, playtesting results were catastrophic. Players were just crashing left and right. In fact, seemingly to drive this point home, one of our first playtesters to come in was actually a C-130 pilot. And even he couldn't keep one of our planes in the air. And even in the best cases, when players weren't immediately dying once they went into plane mode, they'd only ever be seen flying way up here, hundreds of meters away from any danger or anything interesting, just flying straight across the city. It was just about as boring as flight could possibly be. So initially, we worked on addressing several relatively small surrounding issues. One such issue was that players were very often moving their camera while flying, especially immediately after transforming a VTOL, because when they were in helicopter mode, moving their camera was actually how you aimed at stuff, but that's not true when you're in a plane mode. So we made the camera turn immediately after the player input rather than after a time delay. But that wasn't enough. As you can imagine, this is a pretty dangerous angle when you're moving 100 miles an hour. Here's what it looks like just 5 frames later. You're already dead. So we decided to lock the camera completely while in a plane. We also dabbled with giving the planes higher maneuverability, but that was a real double-edged sword because it allowed the player to get out of a bad situation quicker, but it also made the handling twitchier so they can get into trouble all that much faster as well. These and other somewhat minimal fixes did indeed improve on player success rate, but not nearly enough for the high bar that we had to reach. So in time, we decided to bite the bullet and rebuild the planes from scratch. The core issue was that the controls. The plane system we inherited from SR2 was built like what you'd see in a plane simulator, and Saints Row is far more arcadey in its gameplay. To turn to the right, the player needed to press the thumbstick to the right in order to engage the ailerons and roll right. Then he had to pull back on the stick to engage the elevators to make the craft pull up, which, since it was sideways in world space, that meant to the right. Now, how many people in this room even know what the hell an aileron or an elevator is? That's way too many people, by the way. Way to ruin that. All right, so we replaced it with a far more arcadey solution. You want to turn right? Just press to the right. Done. It sounds simple, but this was an extremely difficult and super dangerous decision to make. Because we were running out of time in a big way. There was only 1 month left until submission lockdown. And we still had a decent list of other improvements we could make instead. And remember, we're talking about basically destroying everything that we had for an entire class of our vehicles. But ultimately, we decided it was worth putting all of our eggs in one basket and sacrificing the rest of all of our polish list in order to just get a chance to fix the planes. Thankfully, this calculated risk led to huge payoffs. In the very first playtest, we included the new airplane controls. We saw significant gains in how players used planes, VTOLs especially. Moreover, we also saw a dramatic shift in flying habits. Instead of flying high above anything of interest, the players were becoming more daring and swerving through our city streets. So we went from this... it's so boring. It sucks. To this. Yeah. That is pretty much what success looks like. But not all feedback calls for a straightforward response. Knowing how to use your feedback is crucial, as how you respond is often just as important as the fact that you're asking for feedback to begin with. This can be the most important lesson when working with feedback. Responding incorrectly can not only be unhelpful, but actively lead you away from improvement. And importantly, sometimes this means even going directly against what people are actually asking for. So how do you act on feedback but avoid falling into a trap? Trust your personal observations to draw conclusions rather than following specific requests. This means it's far better to actually observe personally playtesting than to simply read about it in a report. Players often really don't know what they want, and that's often true within your team as well. Look for what the actual underlying problem is before contemplating what your solutions might be. And also, just like when working with our system, it's important to build up an intuition. The more playtests that you go to and watch, the more you'll know what to do when a problem comes around. To give a concrete example of this in action, one of the most common request we had in SR3 was for vehicle cameras that were higher and farther back, allowing the player to see more of the road. But just because something comes up a lot or is popular doesn't mean it's right or good. As mentioned earlier, having low, close cameras is important to the feel of the driving as well as the perception of speed. So to raise the cameras would have been to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And as you can see, there's definitely enough of the road visible to act on, so this wasn't really a need so much as a desire that players had. So we decided to hold firm and not acquiesce to this particular piece of feedback. But just because we didn't need to raise the cameras didn't mean there wasn't something to fix. Repeatedly in playtests, we would see the following scenario. A player would begin driving a vehicle and then attempt to move their camera up manually. Then either because they no longer had a good view of the road or because they were otherwise occupied by moving their camera, they would almost inevitably crash. And then after recovering from the crash, they'd begin driving again, and then they'd move their camera again, and then they'd crash again. And then they'd do it again, and again, and again. Most players, they just weren't learning from this experience. But we knew we didn't want to change the default camera angle. That wasn't the right fix. So we decided to suppress the desire to raise the camera instead. We did this by, like what we did on planes, we changed the camera's behavior to return the default angle more aggressively. Instead of waiting for a delay after a manual input, we made it return immediately. This went directly against the stated wishes of our players. As along with requests to make the default cameras higher, we'd often get requests to make the camera return less aggressive, not more. But what we saw from this change was that players would initially still try to move their camera, but then immediately learn that raising the camera wasn't a good option because it would just, return immediately. So then they'd just give up trying and drive normally. But so what? We coaxed players against their own wishes. Why is that victory? Well, we saw a large reduction in requests for higher player cameras altogether, as players were simply accepting what they were given instead of trying to force it into something else. More importantly, because they were no longer trying to move their cameras, players were noticeably more successful at driving in general. And finally, this change actually led to higher rated vehicle gameplay. By all accounts, it was super successful. But be prepared, as big changes like this leads to new feedback from within your team, and they might not be as positive as you'd expect. Teammates may often respond differently than playtesters because they're already used to the old way, whether it was good or bad. So many just see change, and change is scary. Changing our airplane controls and the car follow camera each brought with them a small firestorm from within the team. Each one of these topics generated a sizable thread of the Volition message boards, the gist of which was basically, I'm not very good at my job, which is always fun to read. And as I made all these slides, I had to reread all that stuff. It was awesome. But this type of backlash is usually about people focusing on something they liked with the old way without seeing the benefits of the new method. Having a solid backing from playtest data can help strengthen your resolve during these times and give you the confidence you need to stick to your guns even if it isn't the popular thing. Be sure to explain to your team why the decision was made and use playtesting data to back up your claims. Chances are you won't be able to persuade everyone, but that's fine. Not everybody has to agree with everything you ever put in the game. But taking the time to explain yourself shows that you're listening to their concerns, even if you aren't doing what they're asking for. So to wrap things up, take the time to fully understand your system. It'll pay off by allowing you to work faster. Minimize external dependencies so you can continue working quickly and not have to redo your work. Be sure to have a strong vision before tackling any aspect of your game. break up your work to not only make it go faster, but produce stronger results. Also, perception is far more important than the reality of a situation. Use that to your advantage. And finally, get feedback on your work, both from internal and external sources. But be judicious in your reaction to feedback, as sometimes doing nothing or going directly against the stated desires is the right move. So that's it for the talk. I wanted to throw out a thank you to the rest of the Volition vehicle team, past and present. Without the hard work from our badass programmers and artists, I'd be giving a talk about why our vehicles suck so much. Also, if you're interested in learning more about properly utilizing data from playtesting, Jordan Lin, Volition's Player Experience Manager, will be hosting a roundtable on the subject this afternoon. And on the subject of feedback, make sure to fill out those speaker reviews that you've been doing all week. One last quick plug. Pi Day 2004 is on April 21st, and I love spreading it to new studios. If you've never heard about it before, it's not to be confused with the number Pi Day. That one's lame. The gist of this holiday is to basically just eat an entire pie in a day. But it's so much more than that. So if that's something that interests you, I invite you to come up and talk to me after we've done questions. I think we had like 10 studios doing it last year. It was awesome. All right, so we have some time for questions. I didn't unpause my timer, so I have no idea how much time that is. 10 minutes, excellent.
Hi, you mentioned you had 350 vehicle variables, including 25 alone that would affect turning. Did having so many like knobs to adjust stuff limit bringing people on to actually help you tweak or modify vehicles because of you need to learn so much to control all those variables?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, like I said, I was the only vehicle designer on 3 games, and in all that time, basically nobody could help me with any of this work whatsoever because there was such a huge amount of stuff that they would have to learn to even understand it that like it just wasn't working. And that was actually why I ended up being on Saints Row 3 to begin with, because originally, I was on Red Faction Armageddon, which shipped about 6 months before Saints Row did, and they were looking for vehicle designers that entire time, and we never got anyone. So by the time Red Faction was over, they're like, okay, well, now we need you to do this one, too.
Okay, so just a quick follow-up on that. Does that scare people that you've got the hit by the bus problem?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. We're working on fixing it now, but, because these games came out so quickly behind each other, we just didn't have time for that. So, yeah, if anything happened to me, we would have been totally screwed.
Okay, thanks. Great talk.
What was the biggest discrepancy between a graphical model and the physical model used in your games, and why was it necessary?
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
So what was the biggest difference between the physical model and the asset in your game, and why was it necessary to make that different?
So it's more about like how changes to the physical model mean automatic changes to the handling, right? So basically, since Havoc's a simulation engine, whatever that car would handle like in real life, like that's what you're going to get. And that's really not what I want at all. So, we just had to make sure that it was separated, and then I could tweak values to make it not feel like it's real. But then we had to make sure that like if other people changed stuff, it wouldn't mess up everything I was doing to try to make it what I wanted. Does that answer the question? I'm
just wondering about like which car, I guess, was least realistic to the 3D model that it was using.
Probably that pirate boat that I showed. Like that just had like van handling, and it worked great, and there was no problem with it. But we also had we have supercars in the game, and like for example, our supercars go from 0 to 100 in 1 second. So it's obviously way faster. Like that would take like an astronaut to handle that kind of G-force. Like it's obviously not what you would get in real life, but.
Thanks.
Yep.
Thanks for your talk. I've been working in vehicle dynamics for quite some time, and it's been, I think this is the first GDC session I've seen specifically about this
Yeah,
stuff.
I've never seen anyone.
Just one thing I was going to comment on, even if you're working on a really arcadey title, one of the best things that I've found is local autocross events. The Sports Car Club of America has regions all across the country, and no matter where you live, you can pretty much find places where you can take your real car to like a big parking lot and drive it over the limit.
Yeah, that's a great example. We have guys at Volition that do that stuff, and
Right.
you can do. They're willing to give you a ride along, and
Well, that's what I found is, like, I've taken the physics and the vehicle dynamic programmers with me. And, it's one thing to understand the equations and have the sense of the way the math works and stuff like that, and it's another thing to actually experience it firsthand. So
Yeah, absolutely.
I'd just throw that out as a suggestion to anybody who's working on it to actually get some seat time and, see what it's like in a real car.
yeah, I totally agree. Thanks.
Thanks.
Did you do any analysis of your variables to see how many of them actually changed across all the 90 vehicles? Or were there a lot that were only within, say, 10% of each other for a single variable?
A lot of them were fairly similar. So we have a hierarchy system since we have so many vehicles. So there's the default vehicle variables, and then the next level down is a vehicle group. So a group might be like sports car or muscle car or big domestic car or something like that. And those all inherit everything from the default. And then you have the individual vehicle, which inherits from the group, which inherits from the default. So it's often kind of hard to tell even what variables are actually changed here. But there are definitely some that are changed on every single vehicle in the entire game. There are others that aren't changed as much. I didn't play with viscosity friction all that much because it's super black box. I'd ask programmers, what is this? And nobody knows. So I play around with it, and the best I can say is that it when you decrease the value, it feels like you're slogging through something, which is obviously a super technical way of explaining it. But so I didn't play with that value all that much because it was scary. But yeah, thanks.
So,
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about the challenges you had with boat handling and how you resolved those.
Well, the short answer is we didn't really resolve them much at all. Because in Saints Row 3, boats just weren't a big focus at all. So we basically had the system that we inherited from Saints Row 2, just like we did with planes. But with planes, we had reasons to actually make it better. And with 6 months' time of making everything, there just wasn't enough time for boats, unfortunately. So, the system there was also extremely simulation-based because it was built before I was on the project, and a programmer was like, well, this is how a boat works, so we'll make it like that. And it had significant problems, if what I was talking about with changing the shape of a vehicle and changing its handling, that was actually still true on our boats, but we only had 3 of them. So it wasn't a huge deal, but any time there was a bug, I would have to do a complete new handling pass because how they interacted with the water and everything was all based on the actual shape of the model. So yeah, to answer your question, very poorly.
one thing I found very surprising is the section in your talk about training users out of their desires. And I was wondering if it ever occurred to you during playtesting to ask them why they were doing what they were doing so you could focus on the actual problem they were having as opposed to what they thought the solution was.
I mean, it was, in this particular case, it was very clear what they were trying to do. Everybody wanted higher cameras, and I did not want to give it to them. So, it wasn't, a lot of times it is pretty hard to figure out exactly what they're trying. As I said, going to playtesting builds an intuition towards that. We had a big problem, for example, with players jumping out of our planes when they were in the middle of the, 500 meters in the air and just die. And at first it was weird, but at that point I'd been in hundreds of playtests, and you can just kind of go through the problem in your head. What are they doing? Okay, well, they tried what they thought it would be to shoot, which at the time shooting was on left bumper or something like that, right? So they find out that what they want shoot to be, which is right trigger, obviously, it's not it. So then that just makes them randomly choose other things, right? There's no real rhyme or reason. It's just like, well, is it this thing? Is it this thing? And eventually they hit Y, which is get out of the vehicle. And they probably hit that before left bumper because whoever, thinks left bumper is the answer. So they would just like get out of a plane and fall to their death. And yeah.
Tough, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
So after you made those changes to the aircraft handling, were you still using a simulation-based model at all for that, or was it a total hack, or was it some kind of in-between where you were munging inputs? What was that like?
I'm glad you asked that. I didn't have it in my talk because of time, but I said it was 1 month before submission that we made the choice to change everything. The first attempt that we had was to translate, player input to what the simulation version wanted. And that didn't work at all, and that ate up about 2 weeks. So the actual one that we ended up with, which is really simple, it's just like, this is the turn rate, this is how fast you can accelerate into that turn rate, this is how much you bank, stuff like that. Very simple, super easy to work with. But that only came in about 2 weeks before before lockdown. And our vehicle programmer, Sean Limberg, he was a rock star. I spent some time up front convincing him this was the right way to go, which I'm very glad I did, because at first he didn't want any part of it. But he ended up basically doing all that airplane handling. He had a full load of other work. So he did all of that work at home in his free time on the weekends, and he did it all blind because he didn't even have a game to look at. So like he would come in after a weekend and be like, okay, well, is this what you wanted? And there'd be problems with it, and we'd have to work on it. So yeah, it's but the end result, what we had there has nothing to do with the simulation whatsoever. But we did, because it came so late and we already had all the handling. For the other version, there's an option in the game. You can switch between normal and advanced mode. And so like advanced mode still gives you the simulation version. So I think that's probably all we have.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you. Thanks, everybody.